March 15th, 1943, Baltimore, Maryland. Conservation Workshop, Baltimore Museum of Fine Arts. 27-year-old Lorraine Kendrick sat at her workbench when her fingers froze over the pages of the March 1943 issue of Art Digest. The photograph occupied an entire spread. A Madonna and Child altarpiece, 15th-century Italian, tempera on poplar panel, 16 by 12 inches. Beneath the image ran a caption indicating the piece was from the private collection of Mr. Henrik Lindström in Stockholm, Sweden, acquired in 1939 through intermediaries in New York. Lorraine knew this painting. She remembered every fold of the Virgin's azure mantle, every hairline crack in the gesso, the distinctive abrasion pattern in the gold leaf surrounding the Christ child's halo. 12 years ago, when she was 15, her mother had first brought her to this museum. Young Lorraine had stood in the Italian Renaissance gallery, unable to tear her eyes from this face, solemn, compassionate, infinitely distant. Her mother, art historian Margaret Ashford Kendrick, had explained the egg tempera technique, the symbolism of the colors. But the girl had listened with only half her attention. She simply stared into the Madonna's eyes and felt something shift inside her chest. That same year, the painting vanished. Museum records stated it had been stolen under unclear circumstances on the night of August 23rd to 24th, 1931. Baltimore police conducted a perfunctory investigation, found nothing, closed the case. Her mother had wept for a week. This altarpiece had been her doctoral dissertation subject, her scholarly specialty. And now here it was, in a glossy magazine, in the section about masterworks of Scandinavian private collections. Lorraine set the magazine on her desk and quietly asked the empty workshop how the painting had gotten there. Outside, March rain drummed against the windows. In the hallway, floorboards creaked, the night watchman making his rounds. Lorraine glanced at her wristwatch. 11:30 p.m. She had stayed late working on the conservation of a Flemish triptych from the 1480s. Her hands ached from the precision work. Her eyes burned from hours under the magnifying lamp. But now the fatigue evaporated. She rose, crossed to the filing cabinet, and extracted the folder labeled Losses, 1928 to 1935. Yellowed pages, typewritten text with handwritten corrections. Report dated August 25, 1931, listed the commission members. Chief Curator Thaddeus Cornelius Whitmore, Head of European Art Department Constance Fairchild, Senior Research Associate Margaret Ashford Kendrick, her mother. The report stated that accession number 1924.87, a Madonna and Child altarpiece from the 15th-century Italian school, had been determined absent. Lorraine turned the pages. Over 12 years, the museum had lost 49 objects. Paintings, illuminated manuscripts, carved ivories, liturgical metalwork. All European sacred art, all high value. Thefts, damage during shipment, lost during inventory, deaccessioned as deteriorated beyond repair. A steady stream of losses, year after year. Too steady. Lorraine took a clean sheet of paper and began listing. Each loss, date, reason, who had signed the report. By 2 in the morning, the pattern emerged like an image on a palimpsest revealed through infrared photography. In 68% of cases, Thaddeus Whitmore had authorized the deaccession. He had been chief curator from 1929 to 1941, then retired with honors, established a private conservation studio in Georgetown, and worked on commission, restoring paintings for churches and wealthy collectors. Lorraine recalled when, in early 1940, when she had just begun working at the museum after graduating from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Whitmore had visited the workshop. Tall, gaunt man with nicotine-stained fingers and cold gray eyes. He had examined her graduate thesis project, cleaning of a 14th-century Sienese panel, and told her that she had inherited her mother's talent, but that talent without understanding reality was merely a child's pastime. She had not understood then. She understood now. She folded the papers into her satchel along with the magazine and left the workshop. The watchman dozed at his post, radio quietly playing Glenn Miller. Lorraine walked past, stepped outside. The rain had turned to sleet. She walked through empty streets, thinking that 12 years ago, someone had carried that altarpiece out of the museum. Not simply carried, handed it to someone who smuggled it abroad, sold it to a Swedish collector. The system worked. Museum treasures flowed to Europe, and documents produced tidy explanations. Her mother had died in 1938. Heart attack, 48 years old, buried at Druid Ridge Cemetery. The final years she had barely left the house, drank, wept at night. Lorraine had been in her second year at the academy, came home for holidays without understanding what had happened. Her mother only repeated that she should not have stayed silent, should not have signed. Now Lorraine understood what she had signed. Apartment on North Charles Street, 3rd floor, 2 rooms. Lorraine switched on the lamp, removed her wet coat, put the kettle on. She sat at the table, spread out the papers. 4 hours until dawn. Enough time to begin. She took a clean notebook and wrote on the first page a title describing her investigation. A system for removal of cultural property from Baltimore Museum of Fine Arts spanning 1927 to 1943. Then she began recalling everything she knew about Thaddeus Cornelius Whitmore. Born 1891 in Boston. Entered Harvard in 1909, studied art history and classical languages. Enlisted 1917, served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France, saw action at Belleau Wood, awarded Distinguished Service Cross. After armistice, remained in Europe on Monuments Protection Detail, helped catalog damaged artworks in French cathedrals. Returned 1921, completed doctorate at Columbia on Byzantine icon painting techniques. Arrived in Baltimore in 1927, hired as assistant curator. By 1929, through a combination of scholarly reputation and political maneuvering, he had become chief curator. For 12 years, he controlled all collection movements, acquisitions, deaccessions, loans to exhibitions, transfers for conservation. The museum received objects from estate donations, church closures during the Depression, private collections sold for tax purposes. The flow was enormous, documentation minimal. In such a system, one could easily substitute one object for another, deaccession something valuable as routine, send for restoration and return a forgery. Lorraine remembered a conversation she had overheard in 1941. Old museum guard Beatrice Talbot, who had worked there since 1919, had been telling a younger colleague in the staff room that under Whitmore, everyone had been afraid to speak. He would come into storage, select a painting, and say it was going for restoration. 6 months later, he would bring it back. But it was not the same painting. She could see it. She had been there 20 years. But she had stayed quiet because Dorothy Marsh had not stayed quiet, and they had fired her for insubordination, though she had done nothing wrong. Beatrice Talbot had died in 1942. She was 63. Lorraine wrote until dawn. List of names, who had worked under Whitmore, who had signed reports, who might have known. List of losses, year, description, official reason. By 7 a.m., she had 40 pages in small handwriting. She lay on the sofa, closed her eyes. Outside, gray March morning arrived. In her mind pulsed one thought. Mother knew. She signed the reports because she was afraid, then could not bear it and broke. Lorraine sat up. No, she would not stay silent. At 9 a.m., she arrived at the museum. The director, Pemberton Hughes, received her at 10. Small office, portrait of FDR, bookshelf, window overlooking the sculpture garden. Hughes had been appointed director in 1939 after working for the Smithsonian. 51 years old, graying, portly, perpetually exhausted expression. Hughes asked what was wrong, looking at her face with concern. She placed the magazine on his desk, opened to the relevant page. She told him this was their altarpiece, accession number 1924.87, stolen in 1931, currently in a private collection in Stockholm. Hughes looked at the photograph, then at Lorraine. He asked if she was certain. She replied, "Absolutely." She knew this painting. Her mother had handled its attribution and provenance research. Hughes invoked Margaret's memory, God rest her, and rubbed his temples. But he wondered how it could have reached Sweden. That would be smuggling contraband, a federal offense. Lorraine acknowledged she knew this, and she wanted to conduct an investigation. They had lost 49 objects over the past 16 years, all under one chief curator. Hughes asked if she meant Whitmore. She confirmed. Hughes leaned back in his chair, silent for a long while. Then he spoke. He asked if she realized she was accusing a decorated veteran, a respected scholar, a man who had given this museum 12 years of service. She replied she was accusing a man who had systematically removed valuable artworks from museum collections and sold them abroad. He asked if she had proof. She answered that so far, she had only this photograph and the loss statistics. But if they conducted a complete inventory, examined all deaccession records, cross-referenced dates, the evidence would emerge. Hughes said no. Lorraine did not understand what he meant by no. He clarified, no investigation, not now. She asked why not. Hughes rose, walked to the window, stood with his back to her. He explained they were at war. The museum had lost half its staff to military service or war production jobs. Their budget had been cut to nothing. They had been forced to close entire galleries. They were barely surviving. If he initiated an investigation into the former chief curator, if this became public, did she understand what that meant? Congressional inquiries, withdrawal of federal funding, donors pulling support. The museum would not survive it. Lorraine asked if they were just going to ignore that their collection had been looted. Hughes said they were not ignoring it. They were deferring, until after the war. She pointed out that meanwhile, the evidence would disappear, the witnesses would die, the artworks would be sold again. Hughes turned, looked at her directly. He said he understood her feelings. Her mother had been a brilliant scholar. Her death had been tragic. But Lorraine could not let personal grief cloud professional judgment. Lorraine felt cold fury rise in her chest. She told him this was not grief. This was documentation. 49 objects conservatively valued at over $300,000. That was their institutional legacy, their public trust. Hughes replied he was aware of their responsibilities. He was also aware that this museum operated on a wartime budget of $11,000 annually. They could not afford scandal. Lorraine countered they could not afford silence. They stared at each other. Hughes spoke first. His decision was final. No investigation. She could return to her work. Lorraine picked up the magazine, put it in her satchel. At the door, she turned. She told him her mother had spent her final years knowing something was wrong and being too frightened to act. She would not make that mistake. She left without waiting for a response. That evening, Lorraine walked to the offices of the Baltimore Sun on Calvert Street. The streetlights were dimmed for wartime blackout regulations, and she navigated by the pale glow of the moon. She asked for the city editor. A harried man in shirt sleeves and loosened tie appeared. He asked what she wanted, tersely. She told him she had information about systematic theft from the Baltimore Museum of Fine Arts. He replied they were printing war news and had 10 minutes before deadline. She explained this involved smuggling valuable artworks to neutral countries during wartime, possibly violating neutrality laws. The editor paused. He told her to come with him. They went to a small conference room. Lorraine spread out her documentation, showed in the magazine photograph, the loss records, the pattern of Whitmore's signatures. The editor, whose nameplate read Edmund Carstairs, studied the materials for 20 minutes without speaking. Finally, he asked if she was certain about this. She said yes. He pointed out that Whitmore was well-connected, former Harvard DSC recipient, member of the Baltimore Club. She said she realized that. He asked if she was willing to go on record. She said yes. Carstairs gathered the papers, handed them back. He said he would assign someone. No promises. If the documentation supported her claims, they would run it. If not, he shrugged. She thanked him. She walked home through the darkened streets. The city felt different at night during wartime, quieter, more watchful. Air raid wardens patrolled corners. Windows showed only the faintest light behind blackout curtains. Somewhere to the east, ships were being loaded at the harbor for the Atlantic crossing. Her brother Thomas was with Patton's forces in North Africa. Her cousin James flew B-17s over Germany. The whole world was at war, and she was pursuing art thefts from a decade past. But preserving the past mattered. Without it, what were they fighting for? 2 days later, a reporter named Vincent Mallory telephoned. They met at a diner on Howard Street. Mallory was perhaps 35, lean, skeptical eyes, notebook perpetually in hand. He told her to tell him everything. Lorraine told. 2 hours, coffee growing cold, the diner emptying as the lunch rush ended. Mallory took notes in shorthand, asked sharp questions. When she finished, he explained he would need to verify everything. Talk to museum staff, check public records, try to locate some of these objects. He asked if she understood this could take months. She said she understood. He warned that if Whitmore got wind of it, he would lawyer up, might sue her for defamation. She told him to let him try. Mallory smiled slightly. He said she was either very brave or very foolish. She suggested a third option, very angry. He agreed that worked too. He began investigating. Lorraine continued working at the museum, saying nothing to colleagues. She restored paintings, wrote condition reports, attended department meetings. At night, she researched. Used the Enoch Pratt Free Library, contacted former museum employees through carefully worded letters, wrote to auction houses in New York asking about specific artworks. The responses came slowly. A former cataloger, now retired in Philadelphia, wrote back stating she had always wondered about those deaccessions. Mr. Whitmore had insisted on handling them personally. Never let anyone else examine the pieces before they left the building. A dealer in New York responded to her inquiry about a missing illuminated manuscript, confirming he had handled that piece in 1934, consigned by a gentleman from Baltimore. He could not give her names without a subpoena, but he could confirm the provenance matched her description. Slowly, she assembled the mechanism. Whitmore had not worked alone. He had needed accomplices. Someone at the museum to falsify records, someone in New York to broker sales, someone abroad to receive shipments. The operation was sophisticated, careful, nearly invisible. But not quite. In April, Mallory called. He had found something. 3 paintings Whitmore had deaccessioned as deteriorated in 1935 were sold at Park Burnett Galleries in 1936. All 3 attributed to an anonymous American collector. All 3 purchased by European buyers. Lorraine asked if he could prove they came from Whitmore. He said he was working on it. The gallery was protective of client information, but he had a source willing to talk off the record. May arrived, and with it news of Allied victories in North Africa. Thomas sent a letter from Tunisia. He was safe. The fighting was hard. He would be home when the war ended. Lorraine read it 3 times, folded it carefully, kept it in her pocket. She carried it everywhere, touching it like a talisman during difficult moments. The investigation intensified. Mallory proved relentless. He tracked down every auction house in New York that might have handled Whitmore's pieces. Spent days in the dusty archives of Park Burnett, Christie's, and smaller galleries. He interviewed dealers who had retired, collectors who had purchased and resold, shippers who had handled transatlantic freight in the 1930s. Each conversation added another thread to the web. A shipping clerk remembered crates marked as museum materials going to addresses in Stockholm, Zurich, Paris. A retired customs official recalled Whitmore presenting export permits that seemed slightly irregular but legally sufficient. A Manhattan art dealer admitted, off the record, that Whitmore had offered him pieces from a private collection that he had suspected were museum deaccessions but had not questioned too closely. The prices were too good. the documentation superficially adequate. The dealer told Mallory that everyone in the trade knew something was off, but nobody wanted to look too hard. Depression years, he explained. Business was dying. A man offering quality pieces at below-market prices, you took what you could get. In June, Mallory called Lorraine at the museum. His voice was excited. He had located 2 of the illuminated manuscripts, both in private hands, both showing Baltimore Museum provenance stamps partially removed. You could still see the impression in the vellum where the stamp had been. Owners claimed they bought in good faith from a Georgetown dealer named Clarkson. Clarkson was now deceased, died in 1941, but his widow gave Mallory access to his ledgers. Multiple transactions with T.C. Whitmore, 1932 to 1939. Cash payments totaling over $40,000. Lorraine did the math. $40,000 over 7 years in addition to his museum salary. That was wealth. Real wealth, especially during the Depression, when most Americans were struggling to eat. She asked if Mrs. Clarkson had said anything else. Mallory confirmed she had. She said her husband had always felt bad about those transactions, told her before he died that he had suspected some of the pieces were hot, but convinced himself it was fine because Whitmore worked at a museum. How could museum pieces be stolen from a museum, he had reasoned. The logic made sense until you thought about it. Lorraine asked if she would testify. Mallory said she had already agreed. She wanted to clear her husband's conscience, she said. Thought maybe this would let him rest easier. The pattern solidified into something undeniable. Lorraine continued her own research, spending evenings at the library poring over art auction catalogs from the 1930s. She found 12 more pieces, objects officially listed as destroyed or deteriorated beyond repair in museum records, yet appearing in sales catalogs with suspiciously vague provenances. One evening in early July, she was working late at the museum when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the conservation workshop. She looked up. Constance Fairchild stood in the doorway. Fairchild was 62 now, had been head of European art since 1928. Tall, silver-haired, sharp-eyed woman who had signed many of those deaccession reports alongside Whitmore. Fairchild asked if she could speak with Lorraine. Lorraine said of course. Fairchild entered, closed the door, sat heavily in the chair beside Lorraine's workbench. She said she understood Lorraine had been asking questions about the missing artworks. Lorraine's pulse quickened. She confirmed. Fairchild stated she knew Lorraine had spoken to the newspapers. Lorraine acknowledged she had. Fairchild was silent for a long moment. Then she explained she had been afraid to speak. For years she had been afraid. Whitmore had connections, political connections, social connections. He had made it clear that anyone who questioned him would be destroyed professionally. Lorraine's mother had understood that. She signed those reports because she had a daughter to support, a mortgage to pay. Speaking up would have meant dismissal, blacklisting, ruin. Lorraine began to speak about the truth, but Fairchild interrupted. The truth, Fairchild said, was expensive. Lorraine's mother had paid for it with her health, her peace of mind. Ultimately, her life. Fairchild had watched her decline, knowing she could have helped her, knowing she was too cowardly to act. Lorraine told her she could act now. Fairchild looked at her and asked if Lorraine would introduce her to the reporter. Lorraine said gladly. They met the following week, Lorraine, Mallory, and Fairchild, in a back booth at the same Howard Street diner. Fairchild brought documents, her personal diary entries from the 1930s detailing Whitmore's intimidation tactics. Copies of deaccession reports she had kept, with her own annotations questioning the valuations. Letters from collectors who had contacted the museum asking about pieces they had purchased, pieces that supposedly had been destroyed. Fairchild explained she had kept these all these years, thinking someday she would have the courage to use them. She never did. But perhaps it was not too late. Mallory took notes, asked questions, verified details. When he finished, he looked at Fairchild with something like respect. He told her this was exactly what they needed. With her testimony and documentation, they could make this case airtight. In July, Mallory told Lorraine he was ready to publish. He had corroboration from 4 former museum staff, including Miss Fairchild. He had documentation from the Park Bernay source. He had photographs of 2 pieces showing removed provenance marks. He had ledgers from the Clarkson estate. It was solid. Lorraine asked when. He said Sunday edition, front page. Lorraine spent Saturday night unable to sleep. She walked through the city, past darkened storefronts displaying war bond posters urging citizens to buy bonds and back the attack, past the Basilica of the Assumption, down to the harbor where Liberty ships lay at anchor being loaded for the European theater. The war felt very close that night. Thomas was in Sicily now, preparing for the invasion of Italy. James had completed 30 missions over Germany and was being rotated home. The world was in flames, and she was pursuing art thefts from a decade past. But this mattered. The past mattered. Memory mattered. Preserving what we were, so we would know what we had become. Sunday morning, July 18th, 1943. The headline declared that a war hero stood accused of looting museum treasures. The article ran 4 columns, filled the entire front page, continued inside. Mallory had done thorough work. Dates, objects, names, amounts. Interviews with former staff describing intimidation. Photographs of artworks with visible provenance alterations. Expert analysis estimating total value lost at over $400,000. Fairchild's testimony, on the record, describing years of systematic theft disguised as legitimate deaccessions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday afternoon, FBI agents arrived at the museum. They interviewed Hughes, examined records, took possession of deaccession files. The Bureau had been looking for ways to crack down on wartime smuggling operations, and this case, involving shipments to neutral Sweden during wartime, fell directly under their jurisdiction. That evening, 2 agents visited Lorraine's apartment. They questioned her for 3 hours, methodically going through every detail. She signed a statement. They told her to remain available for further inquiry. Tuesday, Whitmore released a statement through his attorney, Preston Worthington, declaring these allegations categorically false and malicious. He had dedicated his professional life to the Baltimore Museum. He would never betray that trust. This was a vendetta by a bitter employee whose mother had been terminated for cause and who had harbored resentment ever since. The lie about her mother struck like a physical blow. Margaret Kendrick had never been terminated. She had resigned in 1936, citing health reasons. The resignation letter was in the museum archives. Lorraine telephoned Mallory. She told him Whitmore was lying about her mother. She could prove it. He told her to do it. She went to the museum early Wednesday morning, avoiding colleagues, and went directly to the personnel archives. Found her mother's file. Resignation letter, dated March 12, 1936, handwritten on personal stationery, stating that due to declining health and family obligations, she must regretfully tender her resignation effective April 1, 1936. Her years at this institution had been the proudest of her professional life. Signed, Margaret Ashford Kendrick. Lorraine photographed it with her Kodak Brownie, hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the focus. Mallory printed the photograph Thursday with a follow-up article declaring that Whitmore's defense had collapsed and documents contradicted his claims. The article included not just the resignation letter, but interviews with colleagues who had worked with Margaret Kendrick, all testifying to her character, her scholarship, her dedication. The article also revealed that Whitmore himself had signed off on her resignation, accepting it with regret at the loss of a valued colleague. The pressure mounted exponentially. The Maryland Attorney General opened a formal investigation. Federal prosecutors began examining potential violations of the Neutrality Act. Smuggling valuable goods to neutral countries could be construed as undermining the war effort. Art historians across the country wrote letters to newspapers demanding accountability. Museum donors threatened to withdraw funding unless the matter was thoroughly investigated and resolved. Hughes called an emergency board meeting. Lorraine was summoned to testify. She arrived at the museum on a sweltering August afternoon, the humidity thick enough to cut. The boardroom, 12 men in dark suits, one woman, all looking at her with varying expressions of sympathy, suspicion, irritation. She presented her evidence, spread out the documentation she had compiled over months of research. Board members asked questions, some hostile, some genuinely curious. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end, the board chairman, industrialist Reginald Osgood, told her the board appreciated her bringing these matters to light. An independent audit would be conducted by external accountants and art experts. If her allegations proved correct, appropriate action would be taken. She had the board's word. Formal words. But Osgood's tone was sincere, and Lorraine saw several board members nodding in agreement. Better than nothing. Better than silence. The audit began in September 1943. A team of accountants from Price Waterhouse and art experts from the Metropolitan Museum descended on the Baltimore Museum. They spent 2 months examining every deaccession record from 1927 to 1941, cross-referenced against acquisition ledgers, loan agreements, conservation logs, insurance records. Lorraine continued her work, though the atmosphere at the museum had turned strange. Some colleagues avoided her, perhaps fearing association with a troublemaker. Others approached quietly, thanking her, sharing their own suspicions they had never dared voice. In November, the audit team issued their findings. 49 objects definitively lost under questionable circumstances. 23 more with documentation irregularities suggesting possible additional losses. Total estimated value, $520,000. A staggering sum. All losses occurred during Whitmore's tenure as chief curator. In 38 cases, Whitmore personally authorized deaccession without proper board oversight. The report was devastating. It detailed not just the thefts, but the systematic breakdown of institutional controls that had enabled them. Whitmore had exploited wartime disruptions, Depression-era budget cuts, and staff turnover to build a virtually unaccountable fiefdom within the museum. The report recommended immediate criminal investigation, aggressive civil recovery efforts, complete overhaul of collection management procedures, and establishment of independent oversight mechanisms. The board had no choice. They referred the matter to the U.S. Attorney for Maryland. Federal indictment came in January 1944. 5 counts. Theft of property from an institution receiving federal funds, wire fraud, mail fraud related to interstate sale of stolen goods, making false statements in connection with sale of cultural property, conspiracy to transport stolen goods across state lines. Maximum sentence, 35 years federal prison. Whitmore pleaded not guilty. His attorney, Preston Worthington, former Maryland Attorney General and heavyweight Baltimore lawyer, mounted an aggressive defense, claimed the deaccessions were legitimate, properly authorized, conducted according to museum policy, claimed Lorraine was a disgruntled employee with a grudge, claimed the losses were actually legitimate sales to fund museum operations during the Depression years when budgets were non-existent. The trial began in March 1944 in U.S. District Court, Judge Martin Krebs presiding. Lorraine attended every day, sitting in the second row beside Vincent Mallory, who was covering the proceedings for The Sun. Constance Fairchild attended as well, though testifying would cost her dearly. She had already been pressured to resign from the museum, and several former colleagues no longer spoke to her. Whitmore appeared composed. Silver-haired, dignified bearing, dark suit with his DSC ribbon in the lapel. He testified in his own defense, speaking calmly, addressing the jury as equals. He told the gentlemen of the jury he had devoted his life to preserving their cultural heritage. During the Depression, the museum had faced closure. Donors had no money. The city had no budget. Attendance collapsed. He made difficult decisions to keep the doors open. Some lesser works were sold, not stolen, to fund operations, to pay staff salaries, to keep the lights on. Every sale was documented, approved by the director. The prosecution, Assistant U.S. Attorney Wallace Crawford, a sharp-minded former prosecutor from New York, cross-examined. Crawford asked Whitmore to clarify by whom these sales were approved. Whitmore said by Director Amos Beardsley. Crawford noted that Mr. Beardsley had died in 1937. Whitmore confirmed regrettably. Crawford observed that was convenient, and he asked where the documentation was. Whitmore said lost, he presumed. Record-keeping in that period was informal. They were focused on survival, not paperwork. Crawford suggested or destroyed. The defense objected on grounds of speculation. The judge sustained the objection. Crawford changed tack. He held up the Art Digest photograph marked as Exhibit 12, showing the Madonna and Child altarpiece now in Stockholm. He asked if this was one of the lesser works Whitmore had sold to keep the lights on. Whitmore said he did not sell that piece. Crawford noted it had disappeared from museum storage in August 1931. Whitmore was chief curator. He controlled access to storage. He personally signed the deaccession report claiming it was stolen. Yet here it appeared in a Swedish collection, purchased in 1939 from a New York dealer who, according to testimony from Park Burnett Galleries, was acting on behalf of an anonymous American consignor, matching Whitmore's description exactly. How did he explain this? Whitmore said he could not explain how a stolen item reached Sweden. That was not his responsibility. Crawford asked if, as chief curator, security was not his responsibility. Whitmore said the museum had guards. Crawford pointed out these were guards Whitmore supervised, guards whose schedules he controlled, guards who testified under oath that Whitmore often entered storage alone after hours, sometimes carrying wrapped packages when he left. Silence filled the courtroom. Crawford continued. He mentioned the Flemish triptych, deaccessioned in 1934 as deteriorated beyond conservation, with wood panels warped and paint layer flaking catastrophically. Whitmore's exact words in the report. Yet this supposed ruin now hung in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, in perfect condition. They had purchase records showing acquisition from Clarkson Gallery, Georgetown in 1935. Mr. Clarkson's ledgers, seized by FBI, showed payment to Whitmore personally of $4,000. Could he explain this? Whitmore said that was a consulting fee. Crawford asked for what service. Whitmore replied, authentication services. Clarkson occasionally asked him to verify attributions. Crawford asked if he authenticated paintings he had deaccessioned as worthless, that he had claimed were destroyed. The defense objected. The judge overruled. Whitmore's composure cracked slightly. He said museums regularly consulted with former staff regarding attributions. It was standard practice. Crawford asked if Whitmore had informed Baltimore Museum he was authenticating pieces he had previously declared destroyed. Whitmore said he did not recall. Crawford expressed surprise he did not recall $4,000. That was more than a year's salary for most Americans. Whitmore said it was 10 years ago. Crawford let the silence stretch. Then he moved to something more recent. In 1940, 3 illuminated manuscripts disappeared from storage. Whitmore signed the deaccession forms, all 3 listed as damaged by water infiltration during roof repairs. But museum maintenance records showed no roof repairs in 1940. How did he explain this? Whitmore shifted in his seat. Records may have been misfiled, he suggested. Crawford suggested or Whitmore fabricated the explanation. The defense objected. Crawford withdrew the statement. But he continued. FBI document analysts had examined those deaccession forms. They found that Director Beardsley's signature was forged. The ink analysis showed it was added later, probably with a stamp Whitmore created. Did he deny this? Whitmore stammered that was impossible. Crawford stated the FBI lab disagreed, as did Mr. Beardsley's widow, who testified yesterday that her late husband never used that particular signature style after 1935. The trial continued for 3 weeks. Prosecution called 14 witnesses. Former museum staff describing Whitmore's intimidation tactics, dealers confirming transactions, art experts examining the supposedly destroyed items and testifying they showed no deterioration whatsoever. FBI document analysts testified that multiple deaccession reports contained forged signatures of Director Beardsley and board members. Constance Fairchild's testimony was particularly damning. She described in painful detail how Whitmore had threatened her career, her reputation, even hinted at darker consequences if she spoke up, how he had forced her to sign reports she knew were false, how he had systematically isolated anyone who questioned him. She said from the witness stand, tears streaming down her face, that she was a coward. She had watched him steal from the institution she loved, and she said nothing because she was afraid. Margaret Kendrick tried to resist, and it destroyed her. Fairchild did not have her courage. She signed what he told her to sign, and she had lived with that shame every day since. The defense called character witnesses, fellow Harvard alumni, fellow veterans, prominent Baltimore citizens who praised Whitmore's scholarship and integrity. A priest from St. Ignatius Church testified that Whitmore had donated money to restore church artworks damaged during a fire in 1936. He had saved their altarpiece, the priest said, paid for the restoration out of his own pocket, asked for nothing in return. Crawford cross-examined, asking how much Mr. Whitmore donated. The priest said $3,000. Crawford noted that was a generous sum and asked if the priest knew where Whitmore got that money. The priest admitted he had assumed from his salary. Crawford pointed out a museum curator in 1936 earned perhaps $2,000 annually. Yet Whitmore had $3,000 to spare for church restoration? The priest looked uncomfortable. He had never questioned it. It was an act of charity. Crawford suggested, or an act of laundering stolen money through a religious institution. The defense objected strenuously. The judge sustained and told Crawford to tread carefully. A professor from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Elias Merchant, spoke passionately about Whitmore's contributions to Byzantine art scholarship. His monograph on icon painting techniques was definitive, he said. Required reading in the field. The man was brilliant. But under Crawford's questioning, even this testimony revealed complications. Crawford asked where Mr. Whitmore had conducted the research for this monograph. Merchant said at various museums, he believed. Whitmore had access to excellent examples. Crawford asked if that included examples from Baltimore Museum's collection. Merchant said he would assume so. Crawford noted that in fact, 3 icons Whitmore had examined and photographed for his research were now missing from Baltimore Museum. Was it not convenient to have unlimited private access to artworks you were supposedly studying? But the character witnesses could not explain the documentary evidence, could not account for the paintings and manuscripts now appearing in collections worldwide bearing Baltimore Museum provenance stamps, could not explain the forged signatures, the fabricated condition reports, the pattern of losses that ceased entirely after Whitmore's retirement. On April 10, 1944, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood and announced the verdict. On all counts, guilty. Whitmore's face went gray. His attorney immediately requested appeal. The judge noted it for the record. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, April 24, 1944. Federal Judge Martin Krebs addressed Whitmore directly. The judge told Whitmore he had betrayed a sacred public trust. He had exploited his position to systematically loot an institution dedicated to preserving cultural heritage for all citizens. He had invoked his war service, real and honorable service, to shield himself from scrutiny. He had destroyed records, intimidated subordinates, fabricated documents. He had forged the signatures of the dead to cover his crimes. His crimes were not impulsive acts born of desperation, the judge continued, but calculated theft spanning 12 years. He did not steal to survive. He stole because he could, because he felt entitled, because he believed the rules did not apply to him. The court sentenced him to 20 years federal imprisonment to be served at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, with recommendation against parole for at least 15 years. Additionally, restitution in the amount of $520,000 to the Baltimore Museum of Fine Arts, forfeiture of all personal property acquired through these crimes, and permanent prohibition from employment in any museum, gallery, or cultural institution. The judge concluded by asking God to have mercy on his soul. Whitmore stood motionless. When the marshals approached to take him into custody, he seemed to age a decade in seconds. They led him away, and Lorraine watched him go, feeling not triumph but profound exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Mallory fielded most of the questions, but one reporter pushed through to Lorraine, asking how it felt to bring down a war hero. She looked at the man steadily. She told him she had not brought down a war hero. She had exposed a thief. What he did in France did not excuse what he did in Baltimore. Recovery efforts began immediately. Lorraine, now formally appointed assistant curator for Providence Research, a position created specifically for her, funded by emergency grants from concerned donors, began systematically contacting every museum, gallery, and collector known to possess artworks from Whitmore's scheme. She wrote hundreds of letters to museum directors in Boston, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, to private collectors whose names appeared in auction records, to dealers who had handled suspicious transactions. Each letter carefully explained the circumstances, provided documentation of theft, requested voluntary return, or, failing that, offered to negotiate purchase at fair market value using insurance recovery funds. The work was painstaking. Many institutions never responded. Others sent perfunctory refusals through attorneys. But some, a few, responded with genuine distress at learning they had unknowingly purchased stolen goods. The Museum of Fine Arts, Boston returned the Flemish triptych in June 1944, writing that they prided themselves on the integrity of their collection. This acquisition was made in good faith, but justice demanded its return to its rightful home. The Cleveland Museum of Art returned 2 illuminated manuscripts in August. The director wrote personally that they could not in good conscience retain objects acquired through theft, regardless of the legal technicalities of their purchase. A private collector in Philadelphia named Horace Pemberton contacted Lorraine directly. He had purchased a Gothic ivory diptych in 1937, paying $1,200, a fortune during the Depression. When he learned it had been stolen from Baltimore, he was horrified. He wrote that his family had collected art for 3 generations. They had always prided themselves on ethical acquisition. He could not bear the thought of displaying stolen property in his home. Please accept its immediate return, without compensation. Some things mattered more than money. Henrik Lindström in Stockholm wrote in September 1944 a letter expressing deep distress at learning the Madonna altarpiece's true provenance. He had purchased it in good faith in 1939 through what he believed were reputable intermediaries. They presented documentation that appeared legitimate: export certificates, museum deaccession forms, the works. Now he understood these documents were fabrications, and he had been complicit, however unknowingly, in the plunder of the institution's heritage. This weighed heavily on his conscience. Justice demanded the painting's return. He had contacted Swedish authorities to arrange export despite wartime difficulties. Please accept this as small atonement for his unknowing role in this crime against culture. The altarpiece should be home in Baltimore, where it belonged. With deepest respect, Henrik Lindström. The altarpiece returned in November 1944. Lorraine met it at Baltimore Customs on a cold, gray morning. The wooden crate had traveled by cargo ship from Stockholm to New York, then by secure rail freight to Baltimore. A dangerous journey in wartime, with U-boats prowling the Atlantic. She supervised the unpacking personally in the conservation workshop. There, in the same room where she had first seen the magazine photograph 20 months earlier, she carefully removed layer after layer of protective wrapping. The Madonna's face looked back at her exactly as it had 13 years ago when she was a girl standing in the gallery with her mother. Lorraine sat down heavily, the painting cradled in her hands, and wept. Not from grief, but from overwhelming relief. One piece had come home. One piece of her mother's legacy restored. By 1946, 13 objects had returned. The process was agonizingly slow, complicated by post-war chaos in Europe, by legal complexities, by institutional resistance. But each return was a victory. The process taught Lorraine lessons she had never learned in conservation school. She learned international law, the differences between civil and common law systems, between statutes of limitations in various jurisdictions. She learned diplomacy, how to phrase requests so they did not trigger defensive reactions, how to appeal to institutional pride rather than threaten legal action. She learned patience. A museum in Amsterdam took 2 years to respond to her initial letter. When they finally did, it was to ask for more documentation. She provided it. Another year passed. Then they agreed to discuss the matter. The negotiations took 8 months. Finally, in late 1947, they returned a 13th-century illuminated gospel. Not out of legal obligation, they emphasized, but as a gesture of goodwill between cultural institutions. Lorraine accepted it as such. She had learned that saving face mattered. Better to let museums frame returns as magnanimous gestures than to force compliance through lawsuits that might drag on for decades. She learned about human nature. Some collectors returned pieces immediately upon learning they were stolen, horrified at the thought of possessing ill-gotten goods. Others, equally wealthy, refused categorically. One New York industrialist wrote that he paid for this fairly, and that the museum's failure to protect its property was not his problem. She learned about institutional politics. Some museum directors wanted to help but faced board resistance. One wrote confidentially that he personally believed these pieces should be returned, but their board chairman had purchased several items from Whitmore in the 1930s and was threatening to resign and withdraw funding if they cooperated with the investigation. His hands were tied, he apologized. 11 more returned by 1948. Private collectors and smaller institutions, learning of the case, voluntarily repatriated pieces. Some from conscience, some from fear of litigation, some from simple desire to do right. The process taught Lorraine patience. She learned to navigate international law, to work with State Department officials, to appeal to better natures while keeping legal options in reserve. She became expert in provenance research, in diplomatic correspondence, in the delicate art of persuasion. She also learned about resistance. Some institutions refused categorically. A museum in Switzerland claimed sovereign immunity. A collector in Argentina simply ignored all correspondence. Several pieces vanished entirely, sold onward to unknown buyers, lost in the vast gray market of art dealing. But by 1950, 32 of the 49 documented losses had returned. The remaining 17 stayed abroad, in collections unwilling to cooperate, lost to further sales, or simply vanished into the private art market's opaque depths. But 32 was victory. 32 pieces of heritage preserved. 32 testaments to persistence. November 12, 1950, Baltimore Museum of Fine Arts. The gallery had been closed for 3 days for installation. Now, minutes before the public opening, Lorraine stood alone in the exhibition space, surveying her work. The banner spanning the gallery entrance announced, "Recovered Heritage. Artworks returned to Baltimore." 32 objects on display, paintings, manuscripts, ivories, metalwork, each accompanied by a label explaining its theft, its journey across oceans and years, its return home. Lorraine walked slowly through the gallery, examining each piece. The Flemish triptych, its panels glowing under carefully positioned lights. The illuminated manuscripts, open to display their jewel-like miniatures. The Gothic ivory diptych, its delicate carving as perfect as the day it was made 600 years ago. And at the center of the gallery, on the wall where it had hung in 1931, the Madonna and Child altarpiece. She stopped before it. 7 years of work had led to this moment. 7 years of letters, negotiations, legal battles, diplomatic interventions. 7 years of fighting to bring these pieces home. Behind her, footsteps echoed on the marble floor. She turned. Pemberton Hughes approached, now retired but attending as guest of honor. He was 72 now, walking with a cane, his hair completely white. He told her she had done it. She replied, not alone. Many people had helped. He acknowledged, but said she had started it, against his explicit orders, he added with a slight smile. He had been wrong. She had been right. He thought scandal would destroy them. Instead, this, he gestured at the gallery, had brought them more support than they had had in decades. Donors respected integrity. They respected institutions willing to face hard truths. Lorraine nodded. It was true. The publicity around the case, the museum's commitment to recovery and reform, had energized support. Attendance was up. Donations were up. A new generation of board members committed to transparency and accountability had transformed the institution. Hughes said quietly that her mother would be proud. Margaret was the finest scholar he ever worked with. Her death, he had always wondered if things could have been different. Lorraine told him things could be different going forward. That was what mattered. Hughes studied the Madonna, asking if this was her favorite piece. Lorraine confirmed. Her mother would stand here for hours, just looking at it. She said great art was a conversation across centuries, that when you really looked, really saw, you were connected to everyone who had ever stood before it, the artist who painted it, the merchant who commissioned it, the viewers across 500 years. She said that connection was sacred, worth protecting. Hughes agreed she was right. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Hughes said he was sorry he had not helped her when she needed it, sorry he had not believed her when she tried to warn him about Whitmore. Fear made him weak. Lorraine told him fear made many people weak. But he was here now. That counted for something. The gallery doors opened at 1 p.m. Visitors flooded in. Journalists, museum professionals, students, Baltimore residents who had followed the case through 7 years of newspaper coverage. Lorraine conducted the first tour, explaining each object's history, the recovery process, the ongoing efforts to locate the remaining pieces. People listened in silence, then applauded. Several approached afterward with their own stories. Family heirlooms lost during the Depression, artwork stolen during the war, cultural heritage torn away by history's violence. They thanked her for showing that recovery was possible, that persistence mattered, that justice could be achieved even decades later. When everyone finally left, as the November afternoon faded into evening, Lorraine remained. She sat on the bench facing the Madonna altarpiece, alone in the gallery as the light slowly dimmed. She said softly that the painting was home. The painting was silent, but Lorraine imagined she saw something new in those eyes. Not sorrow, not accusation, peace. She rose, turned off the gallery lights one by one, locked the door, walked down the corridor, descended the marble stairs, emerged onto the street. November evening, cold wind carrying the sharp scent of Chesapeake Bay. Lorraine walked toward her apartment on Charles Street and thought about her mother. About standing in this same gallery 23 years ago, a girl learning to see art through her mother's eyes. About her mother's grief when the painting disappeared. About her silence, her breaking, her death at 48. But justice had come. Late, after death, after pain. But it had come. Lorraine stopped on the Howard Street Bridge, the same bridge she had crossed so many times during the investigation. Looked at the city lights, the harbor where ships bobbed at anchor, the illuminated dome of City Hall. She remembered Whitmore's words during the trial, his final statement before sentencing, where he claimed she had destroyed a man of honor over petty vindictiveness, that history would forget her, that he would be remembered as a scholar and patriot. She said aloud to the empty street that no, she had saved what he tried to erase. She was Margaret Kendrick's daughter. She was a conservator. She restored what had been damaged, and she would be remembered for that. The wind pulled at her coat. She stood on the bridge overlooking the city she had helped preserve from losing its history. Not all of it. 32 objects from 49. But it was a beginning. In her satchel lay a new folder, list of the 17 still missing. Locations, contacts, museums, collectors. The work continued. Perhaps another decade. Perhaps her whole life. But Lorraine was ready. She turned and walked home through the cold November night, through streets where lights blazed freely again now that the war was 5 years past, through a city rebuilding itself into something new while honoring what it had been. Walked knowing that tomorrow morning she would wake, Come to the museum, enter the gallery, and see the Madonna in its rightful place. And that would mean everything had been worthwhile. Epilogue. December 1955. Thaddeus Cornelius Whitmore died at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary on December 3, 1955. Heart attack, 64 years old. The prison notified his attorney. His attorney notified the court. The court notified Baltimore Museum. The museum notified Lorraine. She read the telegram without emotion, filed it with the other case documents, closed the folder. Felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, just a kind of empty finality. That afternoon, she received another telegram from the Louvre Museum in Paris, stating they had identified Baltimore provenance on a 15th-century reliquary cross. They believed it was from her loss list and wished to discuss repatriation. Director Georges Salles. Lorraine picked up the telephone, called the State Department, began the paperwork. The work never ended. She was 40 now, had devoted 15 years to this pursuit. The museum had become her life. She had never married, though there had been opportunities. A fellow conservator named Robert Chen had proposed in 1947. They had worked side by side for 2 years, shared lunches in the staff room, walked home together through Baltimore evenings. He was kind, intelligent, shared her passion for art. When he proposed, she had almost said yes. But then a lead came through on one of the missing manuscripts, a possible location in Brussels. She had needed to travel immediately, spend 3 months negotiating. Robert had understood, or tried to. But when she returned, something had shifted. He had met someone else, a teacher at the school where his sister worked. They married in 1948. Lorraine had attended the wedding, smiled through the reception, genuinely wished them happiness. And she had meant it. Robert deserved someone who could give him a full life, not someone married to an obsession. A history professor she had met at a conference had courted her persistently in 1952. Theodore Hartwell, specialist in Renaissance Italy, brilliant lecturer, charming in a slightly rumpled academic way. They had corresponded for months, met when he came to Baltimore for research. He had invited her to dinner, to concerts, to lectures. She had enjoyed his company immensely. During his last visit, he told her to come to Cambridge. There was a position opening at the Fogg Museum. She would be perfect for it. He very much liked to see where this might lead. She had been tempted. Cambridge meant resources, prestige, proximity to major collections. It meant a future with a good man who understood her work. But it also meant leaving Baltimore, leaving the recovered Heritage Gallery, leaving the 17 pieces still missing, leaving her mother's story unfinished. She had told Theodore she could not. Not yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. He had accepted it with grace, though she had seen the disappointment in his eyes. They had corresponded less frequently after that, until eventually the letters stopped. Sometimes she wondered if she had become obsessed, if she had sacrificed too much normal life for this quest. Late at night, alone in her apartment, she would ask herself what mother would want. Would she approve of this single-minded pursuit, or would she want her daughter to live, to love, to build a life beyond museums and missing artworks? But then she would walk through the recovered Heritage Gallery, see families stopping to admire the Madonna, hear docents explaining the story, not just of theft and recovery, but of ordinary people standing up to powerful institutions, of truth prevailing against intimidation. She would see young women stopping before the exhibition placard that mentioned her by name, their expressions thoughtful, perhaps imagining their own possibilities. And she knew it had been worth it. Every letter written, every negotiation endured, every personal sacrifice made. This was her life's work. This mattered. Her mother had taught her to see beauty in old paintings, to read stories in craquelure and gold leaf and tempera layers. But Lorraine had learned something else, that preservation was not passive, that silence enabled theft, that one person's courage could recover what institutions abandoned, that telling the truth, however uncomfortable, was worth any cost. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began drafting a letter to Georges Sale in Paris. The winter sun slanted through her office window, illuminating dust motes floating like gold leaf particles in restorer's light. Outside, Baltimore was thriving. Post-war prosperity, new construction, the harbor crowded with freighters carrying goods to a rebuilding Europe. The war was 10 years past now. The veterans' home, the economy booming, the future bright. But Lorraine's war continued in archives and auction catalogs, in letters to foreign museums, in patient documentation of losses and persistent requests for return. It would continue until she found every piece, or until she died trying. She wrote until the sun set, until the conservation workshop emptied, until only the night watchman remained walking his rounds through galleries filled with paintings that bore witness to human capacity for both creation and theft, for both beauty and betrayal. 33 objects returned now, 16 still missing. The numbers changed slowly, but they changed. Lorraine finished the letter, addressed the envelope, set it aside for morning mailing, turned off her desk lamp, walked through the darkened museum to the Renaissance Gallery one final time that day, stood before the Madonna altarpiece. The security lights cast gentle illumination across the Virgin's face. 500 years old, this painting. Survived plague, war, reformation, theft, exile. Now home. She whispered that the painting should rest well, that she would keep searching for the others. She left the gallery, locked the museum doors, walked into the December night. Snow was beginning to fall, light flakes dissolving on pavement still warm from the day. She walked home through streets decorated for Christmas, past shop windows displaying toys and clothes and the new televisions everyone was buying, past families hurrying home with packages, past the familiar corners and buildings of a city she had devoted her life to serving. At home in her small apartment, she made tea, sat by the window, watched snow accumulate on the fire escape, thought about the day her mother had taken her to see the Madonna for the first time. How young she had been. How the painting had seemed almost alive, speaking across centuries. It was speaking still, not just to her, but to everyone who stood before it and felt that inexplicable stirring that art produces, that recognition of shared humanity across time. That was what Whitmore had tried to steal. Not just objects, but connection, memory, heritage, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself, part of a story that began long before and would continue long after. But he had failed. The Madonna was home, and tomorrow, Lorraine would continue fighting to bring the others home too. She finished her tea, washed the cup, prepared for bed. Before sleeping, she opened her mother's dissertation, the only published copy, University Press, 1930, rebound in 1950 after the original cover had worn through, and read the dedication page stating it was for her daughter Lorraine, who saw with her heart. Lorraine closed the book gently, set it on the nightstand beside the photograph of her mother taken in 1929, standing in the museum gallery beside the Madonna altarpiece, young and hopeful and brilliant. She told the photograph she had finished what her mother started, at least part of it. The rest, she would keep trying. She turned off the light and lay in the darkness listening to snow against the window, to the distant sound of a train whistle from Camden Station, to the quiet breathing of a city at rest. Tomorrow would bring more work, more letters, more searching. The reliquary cross from the Louvre would require months of diplomatic negotiation. There were 3 other leads to follow up on: a collector in Buenos Aires, a church in rural France, a small museum in Norway that might have one of the missing manuscripts. The work would continue as long as she had strength for it. As long as there were pieces to recover, stories to tell, justice to pursue. She slept deeply that night, dreaming of gold leaf and tempera layers and patient hands working to reveal what time and theft had obscured. The beautiful thing beneath, waiting to be seen again. In the morning, she would wake and continue, one letter at a time, one piece at a time, one recovery at a time. One day, perhaps, all 17 remaining pieces would return. Or perhaps not. Perhaps some were lost forever, destroyed, or hidden so deep in private collections they would never surface. But she would keep trying. For her mother, for the institution, for the principle that truth mattered, that justice was worth pursuing even when the path was long and the outcome uncertain, until all that had been scattered was gathered home.